From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. On the south bank of the River Mersey is an ancient settlement built to fight the Vikings that, just a few centuries ago, was a fashionable spa and health resort. Since then, its fortunes have turned.
Runcorn itself is a traditional kind of, town in the north, in many ways suffering from a lot of the similar problems that you would see in many of those towns, the deindustrialisation. I spent some time at a place called Runcorn Shopping City, which is a giant shopping centre, which is essentially a relic of the past. It might have been busy on a weekend a few years ago, well, a couple of decades ago at this stage, but now they're just empty and filled with things like pawnbrokers, bookmakers, pawn shops.
Runcorn isn't the sort of place that often features in the headlines, but this Thursday, it hosts a by-election that's turned it into a national battleground. Nigel Farage, who's recently become a regular visitor, has it firmly in his sights.
Now we're coming for Labour. Runcorn is that kind of constituency. It is Labour's 16th safest seat in the United Kingdom. And all I can tell you is we're giving them one hell of a run for their money. Reform are parking their tanks on the lawns of the Red Wall.
Will Runcorn give Reform a fifth MP in Parliament? And as voting takes place at the same time as the local elections, does this by-election show why Reform poses such a threat to both the Tories and Labour? The story today: Farage parks Reform's tanks on Labour's lawn.
I'm Jerry Scott and I'm the senior political correspondent for The Times.
Jerry, you've been out to Runcorn, which is about to host a really interesting by-election. Before we plunge into what's been happening there, just tell us a little bit more about Runcorn. How strong a Labour seat has this been in the past?
Well, massively. It's been a Labour seat since 1983. So to say that it is a stronghold is a bit of an under-exaggeration, actually. I mean, what we have seen is that there has been a strong Labour presence here, and actually there's been a very kind of loyal presence to its individual MPs. When I was there, I mean, we will get into the kind of circumstances under which this by-election is being held, I'm sure. But Mike Amesbury, the former Labour MP, no one really had a bad word to say about him personally. So it really feels like there was a real kind of local pride in that way. And he had a large majority, a 14,000 majority. Reform came second at the last election, but they were quite far behind. They had something like 18% of the vote share, whereas Labour had over 50%. So whilst they were second, and you can see why they would want to kind of throw the kitchen sink at this by-election, there really was still quite the gulf between the two parties.
Just remind us why Runcorn is about to have a by-election.
So this is quite a strange situation, really. So Mike Amesbury,
very
who I
unusual,
mentioned earlier, very, very weird, was filmed on CCTV repeatedly punching a constituent, in the early hours of the morning, a guy called Paul Fellows. Amesbury punches this man and then continues to punch him as he falls to the floor. In the video, you can hear him, and at one point he says, "You won't threaten the MP again, will you?"
Yes, I am. And you won't threaten the MP ever again, will you?
Oh, is it Mike? Is it Mike?
Yes.
He's the local MP, Jono.
Oh, yeah.
Get him on camera. Get him on camera, Jono. He's the local MP.
So it is quite a shocking piece of footage, and you really can't get away from what happened in there. What Mike Amesbury said at the time is that he felt threatened. And as I was in Runcorn, actually, there was quite a lot of sympathy for Mike Amesbury. People,
really?
Yeah, there really was. A few people said to me, which of us haven't got into a scrap on a Saturday night? To which you might say, not everyone is the local MP, but it really does feel like a momentary lapse in judgment, and one that they could pay heavily for.
Just tell us how Labour responded. You mentioned earlier that when you spoke to the party, they wanted more context, but how did they respond to the whole incident?
Quickly, they suspended Mike pretty much straight away. Eventually was charged, went to court, and he did get what I thought at the time was a particularly kind of harsh sentence for what happened. They did send him to jail, but actually on appeal, that ended up being a suspended sentence. So the appeal judge clearly thought it was a little bit too harsh. He spent 2 nights in prison before being released.
So the local MP goes to prison. There has to be a by-election. Labour has stepped away from defending him. Who are the people running to replace him?
Well, it really is what we would describe as a 2-horse race here. So for Labour, you've got a woman called Karen Shaw.
We've, inherited a more difficult financial situation than we were anticipating. In terms of winter fuel allowance, we have protected the triple lock, and all of those things are enabling us to deliver the things that we're delivering now on public services, on skills.
She was a counsellor, she's an ex-teacher, and actually what I would say is, having met her, she does have a very kind of teacherly manner about her. That is probably evidenced by the fact that one of my questions that I always ask by-election candidates is, if you win, how will you celebrate? And she said, by setting up her office. And I really did have to kind of prod her to say, not even one glass of bubbly to celebrate before the hard work begins. So we've got Karen Shaw. We've then got Reform's Sarah Potchin.
Runcorn and Helsby needs a lawmaker, not a lawbreaker. I feel that Reform UK represents my values. Labour failed us, the Conservatives have failed us. I am Sarah Potchin. I believe in law and order. I am Reform UK.
She is a ex-Conservative councillor and a magistrate. So she really is defending what Labour are pushing her buttons on, which is being a former Conservative. But she has been campaigning strongly on more national issues, so things like immigration and asylum hotels, things like that.
And, Jerry, as you explained, Sarah Potchin is getting a lot of flack from Labour about having been a Tory and having now moved to Reform. Has she explained why?
So her explanation is that basically she lost faith in the party. It was 5 years ago that she was in the party, and it's not, as if she's the only Tory to have defected to Reform. But there are a lot of pictures of her out there, with former cabinet ministers or holding up signs for the Tories campaigning for them. And it does make it uncomfortable for her. But she's not the only one that is kind of being confronted by her path, because Karen Shaw, as a councillor, had previously kind of waxed lyrical about welcoming asylum seekers into the area and saying it was a safe place for them. But one of the first things she did after she was selected as the candidate was launch a petition to close an asylum hotel in the constituency.
Of course, while they're in those hotels, it's also costing the taxpayer a lot of money. And it is also causing some tensions locally as well in the local community. So for both the community and for the asylum seekers, I think the closure of the hotels in the long term is win-win.
So look, in a way, that's politics, right? But both sides are trying to exploit those pasts to their kind of maximum effect.
And is there a Tory candidate standing in Runcorn?
Yes, there is, but it's quite difficult to find them. It's a guy called Sean Holston, but it's fair to say that they've not got a good showing, and really no one was mentioning them when I spoke to voters on the street.
So not much sign of the Tories. Tell us a bit more about the Reform candidate, Sarah Potchin. You actually met her. What was she like?
Yeah, I did. And actually, when we turned up, we had a surprise guest as well. We had Richard Tice, the party's deputy leader, which we weren't expecting. And, I think does show the kind of level of kitchen sinkery, if you will, that Reform are kind of throwing at this seat. They've had multiple visits from Nigel Farage, whereas by comparison, Keir Starmer hasn't visited. Other cabinet members have, but Keir Starmer hasn't, and is unlikely to, as far as I'm aware. But Sarah was very sharp. I'd say she's on the front foot on the big issues for Reform, but it's fair to say that she has some support. And what I would say is, if you looked at Sarah Potchin, I would describe her as someone who really felt like she believed in the Reform message, whatever that message may be on the day.
Right, loyal to whatever the message may be on the day. In terms of polling, do we know how well Reform are doing in Runcorn?
It's really close. I mean, so it's very difficult to do kind of official polling at constituency level, but from speaking to party insiders, they think it could be as close as having 1,000 votes in it. So it is very, very close, and we just don't know which way it's going to go.
And Jerry, you've mentioned that there is, although this has been a Labour stronghold, there is frustration with the party and how they're doing nationally. Just tell us a bit more about what you were hearing. I mean, what were the specific concerns?
Yeah, so I think one example was we turned up at a pub called the Helter Skelter on the Wednesday evening and sat down with a friend of mine, and the person who was sitting behind us was complaining very loudly about Keir Starmer, about decisions that he had made, about things about winter fuel payment, things about disability benefits. And then my friend pointed out that actually he is one of the most dedicated campaigners for Labour in the area. He'd be out door knocking the next day. So one guy called Mark on the doorstep, he said that his only disconnect with Labour was that he didn't like the way Keir Starmer had gone about things, said that he wasn't a fan. So, you know, it is not rosy for the party on the ground. The question will be basically who is the least unpopular rather than who is the most popular, I think.
And from ordinary people you met around the constituency, how did they view Reform and Sarah Potchin?
Yeah, well, they didn't know much about Sarah Potchin as a kind of individual, but what they did know about was Nigel Farage. And I spoke to multiple people who, like I said earlier, were considering potentially voting Green, and when told it was a two-horse race, said, "Oh well, I'll be voting for Labour then." Reform obviously think that in some sections of the constituency, Nigel Farage is an asset. If I was talking about that office earlier in Runcorn Shopping City, the photographs, you've got Sarah Potchin kind of standing behind Farage. So it gives you an indication of who they think is the more popular candidate. The Runcorn constituency has always got caught up in this battle between the two leaders and what that means for the future of our politics. Because, to be clear, this is a really big test for both of them. It's Keir Starmer's first big electoral test since winning that election. It's Nigel Farage's first big test since that surge for Reform in the polls. So whilst this is a local vote, it really does have national implications because it will give us a taster. It won't be an exact science, but it will give us a taster of whether Reform is on its way to forming in the future what would be the official opposition. There is a lot riding on this for Reform. You know, I think if they lose it, what we will hear is a spin of, well, we still did very well, do as well as we did, and it shows that we are surging in the polls. You could argue that for Labour it is a little bit more high stakes, because if they were to lose, that really would show some dissatisfaction with the way the government is going.
Jerry, you were just explaining how Runcorn, the by-election, could end up being almost a popularity contest between Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage. We know that Keir Starmer hasn't made an appearance in the constituency yet. Other ministers have, he hasn't. Just explain how much of a presence Nigel Farage has been and what he's been saying about Runcorn and the local elections.
So he's been multiple times, and his message has been, you know, that it is an area that Labour has let down. He believes it is a place that, you know, Reform could get a stronghold and could help the constituency.
This is the first by-election of this Parliament. Wow, have we got a great candidate for the Runcorn and Helsby by-election. We've selected a candidate who's going to be a lawmaker, and I promise not a lawbreaker.
It's a similar message to the one that he gives all over the country. And I should mount a slight bit of a defence for Keir Starmer not visiting. It's a lot more difficult to do those kind of things when you're the Prime Minister. And of course, he was off at the Pope's funeral the weekend just gone, which you kind of might argue is a little bit more important than the Runcorn by-election. But, you know, it has been noticed on the ground that Nigel Farage has been visiting and Keir Starmer hasn't.
Nigel Farage has talked about Reform parking their tanks on the lawn of what was the Red Wall. Is that sort of very much in their sights now? Is that a whole patch that could turn?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you look at what happened with the steelworks in Scunthorpe just in the recent weeks, Nigel Farage is really making himself out to be a kind of working class hero at this stage, right? That is what he is appealing to. And there's, you know, without getting too politically nerdy about it, but there is a fascinating mirror with the way, if you look at what the Republicans in America have done, they've been speaking the language of the unions for many, many months and appealing to that kind of that more traditional left vote. And I think we're starting to see that with reform in this country as well. It's not just your right-wing voters, it is kind of your very traditional left voters as well, who may have similar concerns in some areas. It's the old kind of political horseshoe of those two sides kind of meeting eventually. But Farage's problem, as ever, will be with delivery. And, there are other elections going on this week in the locals, including a mayoral election, which Reform may well win in Lincolnshire. And actually, it's going to be the first time that Reform may have a record to defend. It's, very easy to be what I'm sure his detractors would describe as kind of like carping on from the sidelines, but actually having to deliver and do things is very different. So this could be a very consequential set of elections for Reform in many ways.
It is really interesting. There is this big realignment happening, and not just in Britain, but sort of across the Western world, where you do have parties of the right, like Reform, actually sort of talking about nationalisation, as we saw with Scunthorpe. The politics is turned on its head a bit. America is obviously a prime example. Nigel Farage has always been keen to big up his relationship, wanting to act as a bridge to Donald Trump. Has that gone away a bit now?
You don't hear him talking about it quite so much, do you? It feels like that kind of rift between him and Elon Musk might have done a bit of damage.
Just remind us about that.
Well, of course, so Elon Musk essentially suggested that Nigel Farage might not be the best person to lead Reform anymore, and in fact suggested that Rupert Lowe, the now former Reform MP, who Nigel Farage has had a spectacular falling out with, might be better. I think it's politically smart, actually, for Farage to not be mentioning Donald Trump as much, because if you look at the polling, Trump is consistently unpopular with the British public. So that might play to a certain section of his support and audience. But if he is wanting to look at mass appeal, if he's wanting to attract people on the right as well as the kind of the harder left, then I think that her dialing down on his close relationship with Donald Trump is quite a politically smart thing to do.
And you mentioned Rupert Lowe there. The last time we had you on the podcast was actually to talk about that huge rift between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe. Is that almost the template for what could still be the undoing of Reform?
So I think this is always a risk with parties that Nigel Farage is involved in. And, I don't say this as a criticism, but if you have parties that are made up of people with strong opinions who can't necessarily find a home for their politics elsewhere, then these arguments, they do happen. And one of the criticisms that's levelled at Nigel Farage continuously is that if it's not the Nigel Farage show, he's not interested.
And we'll see how that plays out in Runcorn in this by-election. But as you mentioned just now, there are local elections happening at the same time. Stepping back from Runcorn, give us a sense of the bigger picture nationally. I mean, how are Reform set to do in the local elections?
So they're probably going to do pretty well. There's 6 mayoral elections, 23, I think, councils up for grabs, and they're probably going to do pretty well. I mentioned 2 areas they're focusing on there, but they've also got Andrea Jenkins, the former Tory MP, running for them in the Lincolnshire mayoral race, which would be kind of a big one for them to get. And indeed, like I say, would be the first time they have power, really. First time they have the power to change anything and do anything, which is both a blessing and a curse for a party, really, because then you really have to start proving what you've been talking about.
And Jerry, with Runcorn, obviously, as we've been saying, it does seem like a 2-horse race. So we've been talking about Labour versus Reform. With the local elections, it feels like actually it's going to be more the Tories versus Reform. They'll be defending a lot of those local election seats. Just give us a sense of how much they've got to lose.
I mean, look, I think this is massive for Conor Badenoch. And if you thought that there were murmurings about Robert Jenrick snapping at her heels before these elections, wait until afterwards, basically. She's already said they're coming from a high bar. I think these seats were last up in 2021. So it is a completely different world we live in from kind of how the Tories were doing then. So it is going to be really difficult for her. But she isn't just fighting to be kind of against Reform. She's also fighting for who is kind of looking like the official opposition. But also she's fighting against people like the Lib Dems in a lot of those former Tory shires.
I've set the Liberal Democrats the target of being the best opposition the Labour government in this Parliament by the way we conduct ourselves and by the issues we take.
She's also up against, in some places, the Greens. The Greens might be the kind of surprise story of the night if they take some town halls off of Labour, for example, on their kind of soft left flank.
The Green Party has just hit 60,000 members. A huge, huge thank you and welcome to everyone who's joined the party recently.
And there's clearly a lot of pressure on the Tories who expect not to do as well as they did before. There's been a lot of talk as a result of that about forming an alliance with Reform. Just tell us where all of that chatter has got to.
Yeah, I mean, it gets quite confusing because the line seems to change day to day, really. But what Kemi Badenoch has said is that she's open to alliances on a local level, but she doesn't want kind of any national pacts or coalitions or reforms or anything like that.
Will you forbid your councillors to go into a coalition with Reform?
I'm not going into any coalition with Nigel Farage. At local level, it's different. In the national election, you can rerun the election. At local level, you can't. So there might be no overall control.
And give us a sense of what that would look like on a local level.
Well, what that might mean is kind of, stepping back if a particular candidate is more popular, or actually just having almost like confidence and supply agreement. So if you've got a group of Reform councillors and a group of Tory councillors, they might agree that they will vote in the same way in order to beat what would have been otherwise a Labour majority. But there are splits within the Conservative Party about whether this is a good idea or not. Robert Jenrick publicly says that he's against, but he's also been caught privately speaking about a need to unite the right as it is.
The worry is that they become a kind of permanent or semi-permanent fixture on the British political scene. I don't know about you, but I'm not prepared for that to happen. I want the right to be united. And so one way or another, I'm determined to do that and to bring this coalition together.
Ben Houchin, the mayor in Tees Valley, has said that he's kind of for this kind of thing, and there doesn't seem to be too much agreement on how to go forward on that. The problem for Kemi Badenoch will be is that if these results are particularly bad, worse than the expectation management would lead us to believe, there will be more and more calls for her to potentially speak to Nigel Farage. But what it should be said actually is that Farage has also ruled out any coalitions or pacts. He says his aim is to kill off the Tories rather than kind of join them. So I'm not sure it would be a goer even if the Tories were on side.
And do you think he means that, or is that a negotiating position? Is that trying to demand
politics? Who knows? Who knows? You can't possibly expect me to predict that.
But is that something that will become a much more acute concern for Kemi Badenoch? Is this something people are going to be talking about when the local elections are over?
Absolutely. And if Reform's popularity continues to surge, if they win a lot of seats in these local elections, if they get a mayoralty, if they get a new MP, people will be asking the leadership of the Conservative Party what they're doing to turn it around. And there may start to be questions over whether she is the right leader to take them forward. Those questions have already happened, which is crazy given how short a time she has been in that job. But the Conservative Party is a pretty kind of ferocious beast in terms of getting rid of their leaders when they don't feel like they're performing. So I wouldn't rule it out.
This really is a test for her. And looking at Runcorn, a safe Labour seat, which is being fiercely fought over at the moment ahead of this by-election. If Reform do win there, will that be a bit of a test for Keir Starmer? Is that a measure of how well he's doing? Will that worry him?
I think so. And, last time we had these set of kind of council and things like that in 2021, the results were so bad that Keir Starmer considered resigning as leader of the Labour Party. So these kind of results, they can have a big impact. Now, look, I'm not suggesting at all that he would consider resigning if it didn't go well for him on the night. But what it does mean is politicians do see these kind of things as votes of confidence in the way that they're going. And if what is being picked up on the ground by the teams who are out there knocking on doors every single day is unhappiness with the way the government is handling things, whether it's, the NHS or whether it's winter fuel payments, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's tax, whether it's, disability benefits, whether it's transgender rights, then that will be fed back to number 10 and those who are putting together the strategy at a national level. So it is a big test for him as well. And it will, there will be an amount of kind of built-in understanding that there will be kind of national things that will buffer this by-election, but to lose it coming from, a strong majority would be a pretty big blow.
Jerry, so many political pundits are focusing on Runcorn and these local elections. It feels like a real flashpoint because Reform are doing so well in the polls. Is that unusual, though? It does feel like we've been here before. Reform and many of its antecedents, Brexit Party, UKIP, did very well in the polls, but it didn't always lead to electoral success. A bit like the SDP decades before. Are we paying too much attention to them? I mean, should we? Are the polls an accurate reflection of how they'll actually do come the next election?
I think we're always paying too much attention to the polls, to be honest. But in this case in particular, I think, as there has been shown time and time again, it's very easy for people to say, oh, well, I'll vote for the party that I don't know or is new because I'm fed up with the status quo. But it's very different actually putting that cross in the box when you're filling in your ballot paper. What I would also say is people do use by-elections as a protest vote. So even if Reform win here, it's unwise to extrapolate that too heavily to the whole country. It gives us an indication, but it doesn't give us a fully rounded view. And, whatever side loses on the night in Runcorn, but also, when we tot up the winners and losers across the country, will be kind of consoling themselves with that fact that by-elections are often protest votes. But let's see what the numbers end up being on the night.
And just finally, however Reform do on the night, whether they win a lot of seats across the country in the local elections, whether they win in Runcorn, it does feel like they're already making a huge impact on the political scene. I mean, whether it's people talking about the polls or the parties themselves, the Tories and Labour, sort of forming policy around Reform. Are they an outsized presence in the political landscape now?
I suppose the short answer is yes, but I think, as with all these things, you ignore kind of the groundswell at your peril in politics. It's very easy to dismiss, which I don't really think that Labour or the Tories are doing, because, as you say, they have pivoted their policies to really fight against that. I mean, you can't really, as a kind of big piece of political study, if you looked at where Nigel Farage and his parties were a few years ago compared to now, it is like chalk and cheese, and it has become a political movement that has engaged people in politics in a way that they have not felt like they have been able to be engaged for kind of years. So there is something very strong in their messaging, whether you agree with it or not. And I think, it speaks to the fact that people have felt let down by politics, that they have felt locked out of the conversation. So if nothing else, it feels like if the conversation's been tilted towards the kind of things that Reform are talking about, then at the very least, maybe politicians are talking about the things that voters care about as well, and that can only be a good thing.
That was the Times senior political correspondent, Gerry Scott. She'll be up all night waiting for the Runcorn result to come in, and there'll be live coverage on Times Radio. Just a reminder that there are 15 candidates standing in that by-election, and here, in case you're voting, is a full list of them. Brace yourselves. Catherine Ann Blakelock for the English Democrats, Dan Clark for the Liberal Party, Chris Copeman for the Green Party, Paul Duffy for the Liberal Democrats, Peter Ford for the Workers' Party, Howling Lord Hope for the monster-raving Looney Party, Sean Halston for the Conservatives, Jason Philip Hughes for Volt UK, Alan McKee standing as an independent, Graham Harry Moore for the English Constitution Party, Paul Andrew Murphy for the Social Democratic Party, Sarah Pochin for the Reform Party, Karen Shaw for Labour, John Stevens for Rejoin EU, and Michael Williams standing as an independent. You can find all the latest on Runcorn and the local elections at thetimes.com with a subscription. Today's producers were Euan Dawtrey, Taryn Siegel and Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.